Gun rights, the Second Amendment, and President Obama's push for new gun restrictions sparked some really strong reaction in last night's Republican debate. Senator Marco Rubio among those slamming the president's plan. Here's what he said.
The Second Amendment is not an option. It is not a suggestion. It is a constitutional right of every American to be able to protect themselves and their families. None of these instances that the president points to as the reason why he's doing these things would have been prevented. You know why? Because criminals don't buy their guns from a gun show. They don't buy their guns from a collector. And they don't buy their guns from a gun store. They steal them. They get them on the black market. And let me tell you, ISIS and terrorists do not get their guns from a gun show.
Well, he packed a lot in there, a lot to talk about. Kevin McCullough is talk show host for Salem Media Group and a columnist for townhall.com. Emily Tish Sussman is campaign director for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Welcome to both of you, Kevin and Emily. Good to have you both here today.
Good morning.
Thank you, Martha.
Emily, let me go to you first on that. I got a lot of response in the room when he said the Second Amendment is not an option. It's not a suggestion. It's the Second Amendment. We have the right in this country to own guns.
Absolutely. And when you speak broadly like that, that is a real good applause line, and he went right for the meat. Look, I don't think there's a person in this country that does not feel like gun violence is a problem. We have 30,000 gun deaths every year, murders every year, and by the definition of mass shootings, there's one almost every day. So the question is, what do you do about it? When people are feeling like this is at a fever pitch, the answer is not do nothing. So the stance the president is taking, that some have taken, is keep the guns out of the dangerous people's hands in the first place. The other perspective is kind of, arm everyone and let everyone go wild, and some vigilantism. And so that is really what he was playing to. The problem is that's not really where most of the public is. They are really in the place of wanting to keep guns out of dangerous people's hands in the first place. So they're going to have to figure out a way to moderate that position as they move forward.
Well, there's no doubt that Emily's viewpoint is going to be heard quite a bit when you get to the general election here, because obviously the country is very upset about the violence that we've seen here, Kevin. The question is going to be how to get at it. Let's take a look at Chris Christie on this and get that sound in as well, and then we'll go back to Kevin for his reaction.
I don't think the founders put the Second Amendment as number 2 by accident. I don't think they dropped all the amendments into a hat and picked them out of a hat. I think they made the Second Amendment because they thought it was just that important.
Kevin, what do you think?
Well, I think that some of what Emily said is true, but the question is tactics. It's not philosophy. And so if we're talking about effective prevention of crazy people and people that are unstable from getting guns, we should probably start by enforcing the hundreds of laws that are on the books currently that the current administration seems to have zero desire to enforce to begin with. And the Charleston, South Carolina shooting was a prime example. None of the executive orders that the president just put into play, unconstitutionally some would argue, would have done anything to prevent Dylan Roof from committing that crime. He did not go through a background check, as is the law of the land. And when we do not enforce the laws that are there, the only measure of defense that is left for the average citizen is to defend myself.
Yeah, I would actually encourage to get into the president's executive orders, because much of what he did is actually to staff up and make sure the laws that are on the books actually can be enforced. And I'm glad that you brought up the Charleston loophole, which is the default proceed, which means that if someone goes to process a background check and they can't get the information back within 3 days, then they proceed with it anyway. Because part of the reason they couldn't proceed with it is because ATF has been so gutted, so understaffed, that they can't get these processes through in time. So what the president's executive order did was actually staff up that procedure, make it 24 hours, so you wouldn't have to go to default proceed. So actually, that's exactly on point to what the executive order would do.
Actually, it doesn't address the significant issue, which was that Dylan Roof was not prevented by laws already on the books that should have stopped someone in his position from getting a gun. And when you look at Sandy Hook, when you look at San Bernardino, when you look at the reality that our refugee vetting process is failing, hence the arrests in California and Texas last week, when there are more people coming with violent measures towards the law-abiding people of the United States, the only defense and the only time that this was really played out was in the Pamela Geller Draw Muhammad contest. 2 guys showed up to commit a mass shooting. They were met with 300 lawfully armed, law-abiding citizens And that shooting was put down.
Yeah, Emily, how do you answer that? Donald Trump was talking about this morning on another program, and he basically said, you know, what ends all of these acts of violence is when another person enters the scene with a gun. And sadly, in most of the cases that you cited, Sandy Hook and others, the time that it took for someone to show up with a gun was the time that horrific tragedy was able to take place. So I think what they're talking about is having people in place who are armed so that they can defend innocent lives in any of these situations.
Look, absolutely, the tragedies here are horrific. But it's this good guy with a gun fantasy that if just I was armed, if just my friend was armed, then we could have prevented it. The reality is that just isn't the case, and more often the gun can be used against people, the person who is trying to be the good guy with a gun, than reality. Look, the FBI statistics show us that only 3% of mass shootings can have actually been prevented.
Just given what Kevin just told you about Garland, Texas, that the reason that no one was killed there is because people showed up with guns. Good guys showed up with guns.
Martha,
what you just
that,
said makes no sense, Emily.
But unfortunately, that wasn't true at Fort Hood, right? There's tons of guns there.
Because
no, there were plenty of people who were not
personnel were not allowed to carry their weapons on base.
They weren't allowed to carry their weapons.
Look, I don't think we can argue that there's a very large shortage of guns on base, but you can actually talk to survivors of these shootings. Ask them, do you think you would have been able to get a shot off? Would it have been clear to you who the shooter actually was? There's no better spokesperson for this than Colin Goddard, who was in the classroom in Virginia Tech. He said he has thought through this a million times. How many times would he have been able to figure out who the shooter was, get it off, and it's just not possible in that moment of chaos.
Emily, it would be great to interview the victims
of these
shootings. The problem is most of them have ended up dead.
Thank you very much for being here. This is the seeds of a debate and that we're going to hear quite a bit of over the course of the next 10 months. Thank you very much.